Hey there, it's Debbie Potts, the host of the Low Carb Athlete podcast, and I am going to talk to one of my favorites, Cynthia Thurlow. I met her at the nutritional therapy conference a couple of years ago and started following her as millions of other people have, as well as she became a most popular TED Talk on intermittent fasting. And she has a new book out on intermittent fasting. And we're going to dive into that and talk about all things fasting for the female. And I'm going to try to get into a little bit about what if you are a female athlete, as that is my focus on this podcast this new season, to dive into all things fasting, keto, metabolic flexibility, that keto flexibility we've talked about with Ben Azadi, and when we should start to become more intuitive about when to break fast. And I call this intuitive fueling and intuitive training as endurance athletes, triathletes. I know I work out in the morning and I often go swimming masters at lunchtime a few days a week, or I go walk or do something. And then I often lift weights at night or do yoga. So we are a little different than the average individual. And then there's me who just turned 50 this year. And there's others I know as well are concerned about how to improve the aging process as we are the aging athlete. I might not race Ironmans anymore and marathons, and my body doesn't want to do them. I would probably still do them if I could. But there's also that focus on how do I want to look, feel, and perform as I age. So 10, 20, 30 years from now, how do you want to be living your life? I want to be thriving every day, not struggling and blaming my age that I can't do something and have different problems. So we're going to talk about Cynthia's new book, but stay tuned for this podcast. Every Tuesday, I'll have a new episode out and diving into the topics that we hear about everywhere, but specifically for the athlete, the female athlete and the aging athlete, how we should tweak some of those recommendations we hear out there. And again, it's always, it depends, and it's N=1 because we're all so different and there's bioindividuality that we need to address. So I hope you enjoy the show. And if you love the podcast, the Low Carb Athlete podcast, I need your help spreading the word, as there's so many more podcasts out there now, especially since I started co-hosting Fit, Fat, Fast 10 years ago with John Smith. And now the Low Carb Athlete is my focus. And I think I need to start promoting it a little more and asking for your help to share it. We need to get more reviews on iTunes. You can give a 5-star review, be amazing, and give us your feedback, input, as well as a testimonial or recommendation or whatever you want to call it on iTunes, and reach out to me on my podcast page via debbiepotts.net to give some feedback, suggestions, and more topics that you want to hear about this year. So let's talk to Cynthia and we will pick her brain. So stay tuned. Let me bring her on the show for you. Okay, I'm excited to talk to Cynthia, who is just the expert on intermittent fasting these days. And you have this new book out, IF45. Let's kind of talk about your why. You've kind of been on the show before, but we all know your TED Talk. There's millions of people that watch that. Let's kind of dive into what's your motivation to do everything you do every day. You're just on fire on social media. You got this book out. Talk about what drives you to do what you do every day.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it all stems from a service to others. Obviously I worked as a nurse and a nurse practitioner for over 20 years. And when I left clinical medicine 5 years ago, I intrinsically felt that I could make a larger impact not being in the hospital or in the clinic, which is not diminishing the amazing work my colleagues and peers are doing right now. But I just intrinsically felt like I could impact more lives. And so it initially started as I felt like I could run my own business. Although my engineer husband would be the first person to tell you, I just kind of leaped and didn't think. And so almost instantly I was attracting a crowd of women who felt largely ignored and underrepresented by the healthcare system. And by that, I mean women north of 35, women in perimenopause and menopause. And so my initial journey started there, really supporting their needs, both from a nutritional and testing perspective. And then in 2018, I watched a video and I felt a strong connection to, as an introvert, I was like, I need to challenge myself. And so the safest challenge I could think of is I'm going to do a TED Talk. And my husband, when I shared that with him, he was like, is this an ego thing? And I was like, no, this is like a scary thing as an introvert, to get up on stage, commit something to memory and share an idea worth sharing. And so June of 2018, I started the application process. And I did my first talk in December of 2018. And then I'd been accepted to do another talk in March of 2019. And so my why is always about empowering women to live their best lives and really to empower them with information. And I say all the time, I play well with others. My goal is not to be contrary or to, butt heads, but I do think that women at this stage in life are really largely underrepresented, largely unsupported, and oftentimes ignored. So I want to be the voice for women on so many levels. But tying into the book and that talk that you alluded to, in February of 2019, I was hospitalized for 13 days and almost died. And throughout my hospitalization, when I was aware of what was going on, I had two thoughts. One was that I wanted to get home to my children and my husband. And number two is I wanted to give this talk because intellectually in my mind, if I could give the talk, I hadn't really been that sick. And so 27 days after being hospitalized, I did that talk. And really the talk was just to share good information about fasting in women. And then 2 months later, when the talk was released, everything changed. And so I now have a platform with which I can help educate, inspire, and empower women to live their very best lives. And so that's really where the impetus for the book came about, was a desire for women to have realistic, down-to-earth ways to not only talk to their healthcare professionals, but to be able to advocate for themselves and be able to find sustainable strategies that they can use that don't involve, as I affectionately refer to, potions, powders, and junk that is pushed on us in a dieting industry that makes billions of dollars a year. And on so many levels, the thing that humors me the most is that now that I have this ability to connect with so many people, a lot of these companies are now reaching out and want me to peddle their products. And so that's the greatest irony of all. I'm like, no, you don't eat while you're fasted. That's the get-go. You don't take a bar and you don't take that sugary drink. Those are not good things to have while fasted. So that's a little bit about my pain to purpose, if you will.
Well, I started reading your book and I still have to finish it because I was just telling you how I like a real book and I like to, highlight and put all the tabs in it. So I can't wait to get hard copy because it's not out yet as we record this, but I love just how I connect. I feel like I connect with you and Dr. Mindy and Dr. Anna. We all are these strong females that have reached kind of rock bottom health issues, adrenal fatigue, adrenal exhaustion, metabolic chaos, whatever you want to call it, that we found this kind of new sense of purpose. Because I know in the beginning of your book, your intro, I was like, God, that's so much like my story. You think you're doing all the right things and you end up having this total hormonal body dysfunction, everything kind of, anything, it goes wrong. And that's kind of what I feel powered by, reading what you're doing and Dr. Mindy, Dr. Anna, is that, my side of it is more towards endurance athlete, the female athlete, the aging athlete, but I was doing Ironmans, marathons, 50K runs, thriving, and then suddenly, boom, couldn't do anything, gained 30 pounds, but I was doing fasting. I was doing the low heart rate training. I was doing all these right things we all talk about now, but 10 years ago, I was doing it, but doing it too much. And I think there's a lot of it out there that I'm trying to focus on this podcast show, what you're kind of going on your platform for the female fasting, but me, it's like the female athlete, because we're still not normal, just a regular person when we're exercising. We have so much stress in our lives and all that. So I really love what you're doing and how to really embrace that change that we're trying to impact and inspire other women. So I wanted to throw that in there.
No. And I think it's really important. I mean, you have a unique platform because you are a woman at middle age navigating, what sounds like an incredibly athletic driven lifestyle. And it's one of the things that, people will ask, why isn't there more research done on women? Why don't we know more about this? And I think there's a hesitancy with researchers to really understand the way women's bodies work physiologically, because it's so different than a menopausal woman or a man, where the hormones, there's not as much flux, day to day, week to week. And I think that one of the things that I think is really critically important for all women to understand is that as we get older, we can't do the same things. This is not putting us down. This is not minimizing us. It's the acknowledgement that our physiology demands that we be a little kinder to ourselves. Like what I got away with in my 20s and 30s, I could no longer do in my 40s, and certainly not, I just had a big birthday in August. Certainly not as I'm stepping into another new decade. What I do now in the gym is very, very different. And I've had to have conversations, although I've never done an Ironman, and that's an incredible achievement. That's a very small percentage of the population of women that has done that, but an incredible one. So I want to acknowledge that. But the acknowledgement that we have to do more rest days, we may have to get a little more sleep in, we may have to be a little kinder to our bodies. I think we had many years where we're beating our bodies into submission. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, we got to change things up. We need to examine things through a different lens. We need to maybe adjust our macros, more sleep, more rest time. I never like to think of rest days as I'm sitting on the couch, but rest day might be I'm walking outside. It might be that I'm doing like restorative yoga. It's never that I'm sedentary. And I'm sure you probably would agree with that. But again, that female athlete is a really unique subsect of women, really, really unique, because your bodies as a female athlete are put under so much stress, just to perform. It's all a performance mechanism, right? Mm-hmm. So I can appreciate why the healthcare hiccups that many of us, it's almost like a speed bump. It's like we hit the bump and then we're like, okay, now I need to like check things out and decide how I need to change what it is that I'm doing day to day to ensure that I don't run across this again, literally or figuratively.
Yeah. Like, for example, when I started my burnout breakdown in 2013, I finished, I did 15 Ironmans before that and just was thriving all the time. Then it just, the switch flipped, you just kind of feel this burnout breakdown, but I feel like it could be any stressor, not just doing too much exercise, but also I was running my own business. I was doing my own marketing, the financial stress. And I think for women out there, there's so many external stressors. And then that leads to probably a lot more internal hidden stressors we don't know about unless we test and find out about them. But I think kind of tie that to fasting. How is this intermittent fasting, so powerful for the female, like everyone, but the female specifically? Why do you feel like intermittent fasting is such an important thing? And you wrote a whole book about it.
Yeah, well, I think metabolic health is something that I've gotten very interested in. Obviously, my whole background as a nurse practitioner for 16 years was in cardiology. So I saw the best and the worst of everything from one extreme to another. I got very, very interested, invested in trying to find sustainable things that my patients could do. Not everyone is appropriate to use this as a strategy, but acknowledging that this is getting back to ancestral health patterns, that, there was food scarcity. There was not the 24/7 influx of sugar sweetened beverages and food. The average American, eats anywhere from 10 to 15 times a day. There was a study done by Sachin Panda that came out. They were tracking macros on an app, and the high end of what was considered to be normal was 11 times a day of eating food. And so in many, many ways, I think the average American is no longer healthy. We know based on a 2018 study that from UNC Chapel Hill, looking at metabolic flexibility, it was like 88.2% of the population is metabolically inflexible. I'm sure it's higher now given the past 2 years. And so when you're really looking at the small subsect of the population, which is still metabolically healthy, we are now the outliers. And so that is something that I think is a crime. And I think it causes me great concern for many reasons. But fasting for many of these people who are metabolically inflexible can help them get back to a position where they're able to utilize their hormones, burn fat more efficiently, tap into some of these, primordial kind of experiences like autophagy, et cetera, get back to the point where they can lower their insulin levels and maybe they can lose weight, and then they don't have as much high blood pressure, insulin resistance, diabetes, et cetera. There's a whole, so just about any modern day disease that we're seeing can be tied back to nutritional choices. So eating less often, even for women, is certainly something that we need to be considering. And it's something that we should be having discussions with all of our patients and our clients about the appropriateness of therapy in adults. And so I think when I think about the amount of women, when we're looking at infertility issues, polycystic ovarian syndrome, these estrogen dominant disorders like endometriosis, and, ovarian cysts, et cetera, and the amount of synthetic hormones that we are ingesting for contraception and other reasons, it just really begs the discussion of, can we be doing better? Can we be offering more strategies that can help men and women, but certainly for the context of our discussion, embrace strategies that are going to allow them to live healthier, longer lives? Because there's nothing sadder to me than seeing someone who's the same age that I am that's really suffering, because it doesn't have to be that way. Yeah. And so in many ways, I think of it as inspiring people to live their best lives and to acknowledge, irrespective of chronologically where you fall, you can still live a vibrant, healthy lifestyle. And you don't have to look at it as, because I heard this, I was at my reunion a few years ago and people were like, oh, you're just, you just have good genetics. No, it's a purposeful way of living, because I want to be able to keep up with my kids and eventually my grandkids. And so the initial impetus was really to help people train their bodies into becoming much more metabolically flexible again.
That's what I keep saying, because I just turned 50 last month. And I always want to say, like, what are you doing now to promote or embrace the aging process? So your future self, you are thriving every day. You feel your best, look your best, and perform your best 10, 20, 30 years from now. I think people don't focus on what are you doing now to promote what you're going to be doing when you're older. And I think people blame the aging process so much when they have these different unexplained symptoms. They just think, oh, it's my normal, I'm getting older. And that's my biggest pet peeve, is like, oh, I can't do this. I feel like this way, I'm just falling apart, I'm getting older. And it's just like, no, take control, take ownership, and do something about it.
Right. Well, and I think those limiting beliefs are so embedded in our culture. And that's why when I talk about women feeling invisible, they feel invisible from like a media perspective because they're so grossly underrepresented, because a lot of what we see of women that are in age, they don't look like the average woman. And whether it's through interventions or surgery or et cetera, and there's no judgment on my part what people choose to do with their bodies and what they need to do. But I think there are these persistent kind of limiting beliefs for many people that don't allow them to think about or to entertain the possibility things could ever be better. Like, there are so many things that go on physiologically with women's bodies and perimenopause that if they don't understand, then there's no way they're going to be able to make the changes that they need to do to ensure that they live a healthy next 20, 30 plus years. We spend 40% of our lifetime in menopause. And so I think it's important for people. I never thought about menopause until I got close to menopause. Like, that's the honest answer. Like, I never thought about it. And it's because as clinicians, we learn a lot about, puberty and menstruation and contraception and pregnancy and the postpartum period. And, that period after women are done having children, no one talks about perimenopause. I didn't even think about it till I hit the wall. And then I realized that's where I was. And certainly menopause, that's old women. That's not like young women, that's old women. And so I think in so many levels, like, we have to change the narrative. And as you mentioned, Dr. Mindy, Dr. Anna, yourself, me, so many of us are starting to kind of break those barriers down and open the discussion so that there isn't the shame. There's so many women who are ashamed to talk about aging. They're ashamed to talk about what's changing in their bodies. They're ashamed to even talk to their healthcare professionals about it. I remember I used to have women crying, like, I'm a nurse practitioner in cardiology, and I'd have women crying about non-cardiac related issues because they felt safe and they felt heard. And so that's what I think so many of us are trying to do, is change the narrative, get women talking about what they're experiencing and know what to expect so that they don't end up hitting the perimenopause wall like you and I went through. I tell people all the time, I was shocked. I was like, wait a minute, I've been doing everything right. And all of a sudden you're telling me I'm doing everything wrong. Like, no one told me I needed to worry about these things. I thought I was doing all the right things.
Yeah. And I think that's what is so important to teach people about fasting, because it's free. Yeah. And like you're talking about, different companies reaching out to you. we'll talk about when you eat, the fast and the feast, but what we eat is, you're a nutritional therapy practitioner as well, that we're eating real food. And I think a lot of this marketing out there, like, oh, I'm sure there's a lot of things coming out for fasting. And then when you eat, it's what you eat. So I always, for years, have talked about what you eat, when you eat, how, and why. And I think those are such important concepts for everyone, especially athletes, get confused too. And I'm trying to do specific episodes on this. Is like, do you eat before you work out? When is it not good to do a fasted workout, and go into that? But nutritionally, I think we need to talk about what we're eating as well as when not to eat. Because as you're saying, people eat too many times during the day, and it's not really promoted as much out in the media because no one makes money off not eating.
Right. And it's so incredibly unfortunate that everyone is thinking ultimately it has to be a financial gain. This is something that I just find profusely and profoundly disappointing, is that we aren't standing up enough for ourselves and for one another to say, you know what, we need to embrace the way that our bodies are designed. We went through feast times and famine times, and there was food scarcity. And so if our bodies weren't designed to fast, we would not have survived as a species. I think that's rule number one. But I think it's also equally important to just open up the discussion and say, we may all need to fast a little differently, and that's totally okay. Like, I have very athletic teenage boys, and you better believe they eat a voluminous amount of food before games, before they swim. And so I've allowed them to kind of experiment to find out what works best for them and their bodies. Like, I have one kiddo who comes home from school, has a massive meal before he swims at 6:30. And he knows he needs more carbs. He needs some protein, he needs more carbs. The other one eats a smaller meal and then eats a massive meal after football practice. And so much the same with women. When we're talking about nutrition really is the critical missing piece. We unfortunately don't do a great job as clinicians because we aren't trained. Obviously I got my training outside of my education, but we don't get a lot of information. And most of what we get as traditional allopathic trained providers is really focused on the my plate, which is very carbohydrate, grain, gluten laden, very small protein amounts, and really focused on consuming a lot of carbohydrates. And I'm not anti-carb, but if you're metabolically unhealthy, you have to be really mindful of your carbohydrate intake. So much to your point, I actually had someone at my house today that was giving us an estimate, and she knows what I do and asked me for some tips for her daughter. And one of the first questions she asked was, can you give me some protein bar recommendations? And so I said, I'm going to give you my standard response when people ask me this question. When I travel with a high quality meat stick, and I travel with salted macadamia nuts. And that is my protein bar, like, quote unquote. But we've gotten conditioned that we need to have things that are quick and accessible. And so it's really important that once we start, really educating our patients and our clients about, macros and how protein is the most satiating macronutrient. And when you get that right, everything else falls into place. And once you get to a point where you're satiated and you're not hungry, then you can really expand the universe. But I agree with you that the processed food industry piece has really conditioned people that we need to be eating and snacking it all day long. And that is not helping metabolic health at all. And certainly not for women. Absolutely not for women.
So what is your book about? What is IF45? Let's kind of dive into that, because I know we'll talk about digestion and eating the right foods, but when we should be fasting and eating, and we'll talk about that for women, but talk about what is the 45 of, well, intermittent fasting is IF, but what is 45 part of it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So my book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, IF45, the IF45 stands for, it's a 45-day plan. So out of that viral TED Talk, my team and I quickly scrambled together and started creating content because people were coming to me and wanted to be coached and wanted to kind of learn. And so this has become my signature program, really guiding people, dripping content every day. These are the ways to really fast properly. So over a 45-day period of time, you're learning the ins and outs of fasting unique to women, as well as, providing the support and services that you need. So we turned it into 45 days. I turned it into 45 days because 30 days was not enough. 45 days was perfect. 60 was a little too long, but 45 was that sweet spot. And so that's really where we initially focused that program. And so now obviously it's been, fine tuned, but that program actually came out of that viral talk. And so it was the desire to be able to educate as many people and empower them to make really good choices for themselves and be able to fast properly. And also under the guise of the unique lens with which women need. We're not many men. We absolutely need a different way of looking at fasting, using fasting as a strategy. And IA45 really dives into all of that, talking about hormones, talking about, strategies if you're still cycling, talking about strategies if you're still, if you're no longer cycling, really looking at nutrition as, really the key. And on so many levels, this is a sword I will die on. Women need animal-based protein. And I think that's really important. I didn't say that to be polarizing or unsupportive of my several vegetarian friends that I have, but it's very hard to hit your protein macros and be lower carbohydrate. And so, from my perspective, the people that do best are oftentimes the ones that are really mindful of hitting those protein macros, which is probably way more than most people are already doing. And then being mindful, making the right choices, non-starchy vegetables, low glycemic berries, as opposed to having breads and pasta and rice, which I'm not suggesting that, if you're metabolically flexible, you can probably have those on occasion, but they should not be part of your everyday diet.
Well, or you do the Wheat Zoomer Vibrant Wellness test that I just did, and we're doing a podcast on it that we're going to go over my lab results. I thought it, was gluten-free. And then I realized there's wheat and everything. And that was a huge inflammatory for my body. And even though you're doing keto, I think a lot of times people do still have some wheat and grains in there that are reactive in their body. So you really can individualize it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the fasting part is, the book you want people to become like from eating a high carb standard American diet? Are you starting there and then teach them how to become fat adapted, then add fasting? Or what do you recommend? How to
I think it depends on where people are starting from. So there might be people like yourself who are already eating a nutrient dense whole food diet that are curious about fasting. So there's ways to support women in that regard. But if we look at the bulk of the population, which we know is not metabolically healthy, they could be a standard American diet couch potato. And so really walking them through slowly, talking to them about meal frequency, if they're going from, 4 or 5 mini meals a day and snacking in between, kind of ratcheting back, their meal frequency, talking to them about the protein intake, which is so important. And unfortunately, for anyone that's listening, Dr. Gabrielle Lyons is like my go-to resource on all things related to muscle protein synthesis. And actually the first time I met her, the first thing she said to me other than hello, so nice to meet you, was, I bet you're not eating enough protein. And I was like, what? And so I've learned so much from her. And so that's why I always believe in practicing gratitude and playing this forward. Most, if not all of us, are not eating enough protein. And so especially for women north of 35, 40, we know sarcopenia is a normal function of aging. We will lose muscle mass as we get older unless we are eating enough protein, doing enough strength training, really being mindful of our sleep quality, et cetera. And so to kind of touch on your question, if someone is metabolically unhealthy, we're going to start with the basics. And I always say, there's a track for individuals that are, maybe they've tried intermittent fasting and they're really looking for success strategy. There's certainly, pathways for people that are really starting with the basics. It could be terrifying to say to someone, I want you to go from having all these mini meals and snacks to suddenly stop snacking. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. That's, I don't know how to even wrap my head around that. And for a lot of people, it's dealing with a degree of cognitive dissonance. Like they've been conditioned to believe that we have to eat to stoke our metabolism or maintain our weight. And I'm the first person to say, BS. There's a lot of things I learned as a baby nurse practitioner and a baby nursing student that are completely wrong. And so this is one of those ways that really helping people understand the why behind the how. Like, this is why we do this, and this is how you do this. So I want people to be able to read the book and be able to walk away with a great sense of purpose and understanding so that they can then bring the strategy into their lifestyle and feel like they've got a resource and a guide that will help them through the process.
That's so great. I think it's so necessary because I think a lot of people get lost in where to start. And when they hear about fasting and then they need to be able to not eat for so long, you have to be able to burn fat and improve that metabolic flexibility first. But I think it's confusing unless you have someone kind of hold your hand the first 4 to 6
Yeah.
weeks to
Yeah.
get that process going as you're doing. And I think you probably learned a lot of fears and myths of what people have experienced or been afraid to do fasting since you started with your TED Talk and doing this coaching online. So what are some big things that you've learned that people are, maybe fearful of, or the myths and common problems, challenges people have?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's important for people to understand that metabolic flexibility doesn't happen overnight. If you're really metabolically inflexible, it may take 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks. So you have to give yourself some grace. The first thing I think people are fearful of, they haven't felt hungry in a long time. And it's because they're eating too frequently, and they're not, they're, as Jason Fung always puts it beautifully, like you have to clear out all the carbohydrates in the fridge before you can get to the freezer to burn fat.
Yeah,
So
I love that.
he's the master analogy, he's the like masterful at analogies. And so I think it's important for people to understand that, this is not a race, it's a journey. And so kind of walking them through ways to do this. But getting back to your original thing, hunger is a big piece. Many people have gotten so disconnected from their bodies, they haven't experienced hunger, so that frightens them. They think they're going to die. I'm not exaggerating. They really have this fear that if they're not eating frequently and they feel hungry, that they're somehow hurting their body. And so allowing people to get comfortable with the thought of being hungry and reminding people it's cyclical, and strategies to address hunger. Obviously, we don't want anyone to be dizzy and passing out and miserable, but it may be that you go from dinner to breakfast, and maybe you're going 12 or 13 hours, and that could seem overwhelming. So slow and steady wins. I think some of the other myths is that people assume that if they're practicing intermittent fasting, that they're starving their bodies. And so it's important for people to understand there's a huge distinction between starvation, which is a choice not to eat at all, versus I'm eating within a feeding window. So I have targeted intake of food and nutrients and macros. That's another one. I would also say that there are a lot of people in the Fit Pro space that I blatantly give incorrect information about the fact that you can eat whatever you want during a fasting window as long as it's under 50 calories. And so I like people to understand what clean fasting is. I like people to understand what dirty fasting is, because I use that as an example of dirty fasting, because I want people to get the best results possible. And so I'm a little bit of a purist in that regard. There's different types of fasting, but people will learn how to clean fast in my book. And I think that's important for not just results, but just to understand the basics, much like when we're going to school and we learn how to properly read and write. We learn the basics so that we can then go on to do more advanced strategies. And so I think of fasting the same way. I would also say that there are a lot of limiting beliefs about that there's blanket statements. Women can't fast. It's dangerous for women to fast. Well, I talk about in the book, instances where it's not appropriate for women to fast. And I'm very outspoken about that. I think it's important for people to understand when to fast and when not to fast, and how to account for where you are in your menstrual cycle, or, are you pregnant or breastfeeding, or are you dealing with, an acute illness? I can assure you, when I left the hospital in March of 2019 and had lost 15 pounds, I did not fast for months. I didn't fast at all. I could tell my blood sugar was off. I needed to eat more frequently because my body had literally been starving for 13 days. So I think it's also important for people to understand that you can fast at some point in your life, maybe take a break and go back to it at another time. So those are the most common either fears or falsities that I hear about, and really try in a very loving way to explain to people that, what you're stating is not correct. And so let's try to reframe either those thoughts, about the hunger, or, the blatant statements that women can't safely fast. And I will be the first person to say there are times when a woman should not fast. But those are, definitely discussed in the book. And I'm sure even in the work that you do with your, your athletic clients, you probably acknowledge if someone's really in a hardcore training state, maybe training for, an endurance race, or maybe they're young, they're in their 20s, and they really are an athlete, not just athletic, they are an athlete, that there probably will be times it's not appropriate for them to fast. And so working with people like yourself or myself or others that are well seasoned to be able to help guide women through those decisions.
Yeah, I think, that's what I learned a lot about my own self is questioning when you're a high performing individual, athlete or not, doesn't matter. You're just a high charging individual that's type A to AAA, and that we don't often know when to stop because we're stubborn and we want to be perfectionists, and I'm going to go 16 or 18 or 24 hours on a fast and not know when those red flags your body's sending you going, okay, I'm going to override that and push through it. But then you're causing your body more harm than good. So I've been trying to express that on the show. And when I'm writing blogs lately, it's like, all right, when is it too much? And it's hard to figure that out because it's so individualized. But I think a lot of women, as myself, like, okay, I'm busy all day Wednesdays and before, pre-COVID, before I moved and changed my whole life, but I would be like not eating till 3:00, but I would lift weights, go run with a client and swim and personal train clients. And then wouldn't get home till 3:00. So then I'm almost fasting 20 hours, but is that good for me? So I think it's figuring out when is it good and when is it not good for those people that are a little bit type AAA.
And I think that's really important. I'll give you a recent example. So right now, my husband was on business travel all last week. So I was solo parenting. I had 2 teens. I'm in this pre-launch book phase. My business is doing really well. And we're still in a new city. So I'm still kind of navigating that. And I said to my husband, I need to be really mindful of how frequently I'm going to the gym, because if I go to the gym and I have more energy when I leave, that's a good sign. If I go to the gym and I tank a couple hours later because I'm really tired, that's a sign I did too much. And so yesterday, coming off of solo parenting for a week, and then my husband was gone for overnight for business. So essentially over the last week and a half, solo parenting. I had a webinar Tuesday night. Wednesday, I was like, okay, it's a day I need to go to the gym because on Thursday I got early appointments. Went to the gym. I only worked out for 30 minutes, but I worked out hard. And then middle of the afternoon, I was like, oh, I don't feel good. And I didn't fast longer. I had a really good high carb meal to break my fast with. I was really well hydrated. But midway through the afternoon, I was like, I feel like I need a nap. And so my blood sugar was fine. That wasn't the issue. I took a 20-minute nap and I woke up and I was like, that's the sign I needed to acknowledge. My body is under too much stress and I got to ramp it back. So today, all I did was walk with my dogs and I was like, I'll see how I'm feeling tomorrow. So I think even for those of us that are high achieving, type A, sympathetic, dominant type people, we really I really lean in, like, what's my sleep quality like? What's my blood sugar doing? How is my energy? Like, that's really important. And it's something that I definitely reinforce in the book, leaning into those symptoms and being honest with yourself. Like I actually earlier today had a meeting with my functional medicine provider, and her first thing out of her mouth was, I'm looking at your labs and they look better, but dang, your cortisol is low. She said, if you were not doing all the things you do, you probably would feel like crap. But she said, I know you're doing all the things. So, continue doing all those things and do a little more. But the point I'm trying to make is that we have to be honest with ourselves. And I'm not trying to be superwoman anymore. I'm not trying to impress anyone. I'm just trying to make sure I can maintain being as metabolically flexible, but also honoring where I am in time and space. And so my big tell, which is what I also teach to my clients, is how's your energy? What's your sleep like? Are you having food cravings? Because when I'm not, when everything's balanced really well, I've got plenty of energy, I sleep well, and I don't have food cravings. But those can be signs that you need to lean in a little bit more. I'm not sure if that's your own experience as well.
Yeah, I think learning when it's okay to eat that, all right, I'm not being mindless eating, I'm being mindful, and really training people. I think after doing your IF45 program, then you should be more intuitive eating, maybe intuitive fueling, I called it, and intuitive training, and figure out, okay, let's listen to my body. But it takes a lot for people, I'm sure you found, to really learn how to go, okay, is that the right signal, or should I push through it and fast longer? And I think it's hard. That's probably why people need your program and coaching to learn more about what is that signal. Does that mean don't eat, or does that mean eat something?
Yeah, because I think on so many ways we're really conditioned to just push through it. Like, whereas women, you just push through it. And I will be the first person to say, I really pay attention to my energy, like really, really pay attention to it. And even sometimes I go to bed at 8:00 at night, and my sons and my husband look at me like I'm insane. And the dogs are thrilled because that means they get to go to bed early.
Yeah.
But it could be that, 8:00 at night, I'm upstairs taking a magnesium soak and I'm going to bed. But leaning in to acknowledge that, it's important for us to figure out what works well for us. I'll give you another example. I do better ending my feeding window earlier in the day. That's the one blessing of the last 2 years, is that I do much better. I sleep better. I have better energy if I finish eating by 5 o'clock. Now, that may not be realistic for everyone that's listening, but honoring your body and where it is. When I eat dinner at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night, my blood sugar isn't as well managed. I don't sleep as well. I don't feel good going to bed with a full stomach ever. And so this is one of those things, honoring bio-individuality, acknowledging like what works best for you. I always sit down with my family to eat dinner, although my feeding window may already be closed. I always sit down with them because it is such a important time to connect with one another. I have women that feel guilty. It's like, you name it. Everyone feels guilty about everything. I feel guilty that I'm not eating in front of my children. I was like, then explain to your children what you're doing. Like, my kids know that I fast. And so they understand that sometimes mom's feeding window ends before we eat dinner, and that's okay. As long as they understand why you're doing it. It's not that you're restricting your food, you're choosing to end your feeding window a little bit earlier. And I think that's, certainly very important. My kids certainly see me eat. They may not see me eat every single day because they're in school most of the day, but really important that we're kind of setting up individuals that come in contact with us with the knowledge of what we're doing, because occasionally I'll hear family members or friends, and I think they're well-meaning, they're like, oh, well, she just has these weird eating habits. No, actually, it's not weird. What's weird is to be eating all day long and eating mini meals and drinking excessively and all the other kind of habits that seem to be the norm. Whereas eating nutrient-dense whole foods and eating less often is considered to be strange or odd. But again, you look at the population at large, and what you can really see is the choices that we're making have a large net impact on our health. Like, someone explained it really well recently and said, the problem with a lot of lifestyle choices is you don't see the impact in the short term, it's in the long term. And I think that's a great example. Like, if you're eating nutrient dense foods, you're exercising, you're sleeping well, you manage your stress, you're probably going to age differently than someone that is doing the exact opposite. And so each one of us is on our own path. Each one of us is, there are our own individuals, but really important that we're honoring and being honest with ourselves. I think that's the gift that I think the past 2 years has given us, is we can really evaluate, like, is our lifestyle serving us well? Because for a lot of people, they made changes. We picked up and moved. And so I think on so many levels, it's important for people to just be honest, like what's working, what isn't working.
Yeah. I mean, we're the same. We moved from Seattle last summer, 2020, and moved in a house in September 2020. Been here, well, over a year now. And it is a new schedule because, we're working at home now and it's different, but there's benefits. And I'm the same. I'd rather, break my fast earlier, and then I don't do well. Everything you said, it was like 100% me. I don't do well eating in the evening. I don't sleep.
Yeah.
My digestion is horrible at nighttime. And so we now it's just my husband and I never could have kids. Another note of dysfunction in my body from doing everything too much. But I usually eat big meal, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and I'll go lift weights like at 5:30, and I'm good. And just have some tea at night. But I think it is finding your own schedule and what works for you in your new life, and eating when you want to, not by time of day. And I said that when our schedules changed in our world last year and a half ago, is, don't eat by the time of the day, breakfast, lunch, dinner. That means move. Let's change what that actually means. It means breakfast time means get outside. Lunchtime means get outside and walk and move, and dinner time, not eat. So I think it's important, but there's so much to talk to, and we're going to run out of time, but I want to make sure we talk about fasting different for women that are cycling females, because that is a whole nother show that we'll have to do a follow-up sometime. But I think it's important for women that are doing the fasting. You're going to educate them on, like you said, when to fast, when not to fast, because there's certain times of the month that the female that's cycling, and then adapt that with their exercise routine as well. We want to change that, and when to eat. Because I think that's such a fascinating topic. And I know you guys have all been talking about that, Dr. Mindy and you and Dr. Anna, about fasting for women, and then what to eat during those times, carbs, keto, whatever. So let's kind of talk a little bit that before we run out of time already.
I think it's an important distinction to make, that I differentiate, like, a lean female athlete is different than the average cycling woman versus the perimenopause and menopause females. And so let me start with the female athlete. So very small subset of the population. If you're really, really lean, digestive rest is a great thing, meaning, 12 hours of not eating a day is great. you probably won't be able, if you're having intense training, you probably won't be able to get your macros in if you have a very tight feeding window. So that's my first qualifier. Cycling women, from the time that they start bleeding till ovulation, you have a lot of flexibility on fasting, longer fast, shorter fasts, pushing your macros one direction or another. And then the closer you get to menstruation, you have to back off on the fasting. And it's important because when we're insulin sensitive at the beginning part of our cycle, when estrogen predominates, we become increasingly less insulin resistant. We become more increasingly insulin resistant in the higher progesterone level phases. And so I generally recommend that women back off on the fasting as they're getting closer to menstruation, adjust their macros accordingly. And the more intense exercise is really during that follicular phase when estrogen predominates, and less intense exercise as they're getting closer to menstruation. And it makes sense. I know that, when I was still getting a regular menstrual cycle, I was a total badass beginning half of my menstrual cycle. And then I would be tired, which is a byproduct of progesterone. Progesterone predominates in the second half of the menstrual cycle, which is the luteal phase. I didn't have as much energy. I needed to do more restorative things. I needed to be a little kinder to my body. That was not the time for me to push the envelope and do CrossFit or do these intense conditioning classes or do Orange Theory Fitness or any of those more intense exercises. And there's a time and space for that kind of physical activity, but you have to be mindful of it. And then perimenopause is the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. You can make the argument it's 4 to 5 years preceding menopause. It really depends on the individual, but for a lot of women that can start in your late 30s. And I'm starting to see more and more women entering menopause in their late 40s. So a time when we have waxing and waning progesterone levels, your ovaries, we are born with a finite amount of eggs, unlike men that replenish sperm every 3 days. So your eggs are getting old, ladies. As you're into your late 30s, eggs are old. You're maybe not ovulating every month. You have less progesterone circulating. You'll get this relative estrogen dominance. And estrogen dominance can manifest in heavier periods. I used to refer to them as the crime scene period. I would pray I would not start my cycle when I was rounding in the hospital. You get fibrocystic breasts, you get moody, you gain weight. All the things we don't want to deal with. And this waxing and waning progesterone, generally relative estrogen dominance. And this waxes and wanes until we get to menopause, which is 12 months without a menstrual cycle. And all throughout that, we have to fast a little differently. It becomes a much more unlevel playing field when we hit perimenopause. Sleep quality becomes much more critically important. Energy levels, macros, you suddenly can't eat the same way. You sure as heck can't eat the same amount of food. The changes in sex hormones can impact your hunger and satiety cues. And so I tell people all the time, perimenopause is when the gloves come off. You got to take it, make it really real. Sleep quality, stress management, nutrition, being mindful of what types of exercise that you're doing, because you may not be able to, you may be lifting heavy, but you may not be doing chronic cardio. And I know that can be a very controversial topic because there are women that want to die on that sword, the proverbial saying. They want to do chronic cardio till they die. And I'm like, that's like about the worst thing you can do for your body if you're in a perimenopause or menopausal state. Short bursts of intense exercise like HIIT or Tabata is much better. And then I feel like menopause for a lot of people, if they transition from perimenopause into menopause pretty easily, they're going to do pretty well. We know based on study research, the women that have the worst symptoms in perimenopause and into menopause generally are insulin resistant. They are generally going to have more hot flashes, more vasomotor symptoms. They may gain more weight. They're just going to be highly prone to inflammation, and that can be from a variety of factors. So at each stage, there are different things we have to look at, different lenses, different strategies to fine tune. But I do feel like the perimenopause and menopausal female is very individual for every woman. It's important to kind of stress the metabolic flexibility piece. The less metabolically flexible you are, the more likely it is going to be a bumpy ride heading into menopause. I have a group of women right now who all made that transition pretty effortlessly. And I think a lot of it has to do with their fasting regimen because they've mastered all those little pieces that I talked about that gets so important. And I don't want anyone to fear aging. That's not the message we're trying to share. It's just, these are the things I wish I had known when I was a younger woman so that I would not have hit perimenopause like a wall. And it sounds like you did as well. Like we want to proactively share with women, like, these are things you need to look out for and you need to start being conscientious about so that you will make that transition perhaps even more effortlessly than we did.
Yeah. And I think that's so important to people realize that they need to individualize it. This is a template. Here's start and let's adjust it and course correct based on what your body's going to be telling you, and learning how to listen to your body is what we're talking about. I do want to add in too, it's what do you find to teach people what to eat? Because I think people are confused because there's so much out there on keto and 50 grams of carbs a day and no carbs, all carbs are bad and dirty versus clean. I think it's confusing. Then like you mentioned Dr. Gabrielle Leon, I loved her stuff. I think it was a nutritional therapy conference pre-COVID, right before the pandemic started. We were at our last conference, and that's, she taught me a lot, is having 1 gram of protein for my goal body weight. And I was never eating enough protein. And I used to be I'm still animal fearful of eating a lot of meat, but I know it's important for women to have more protein, and I like her guidelines. So what kind of just summary of what people can learn from your book of what to eat? We know, talk about not to eat in the fasting period, but feasting, the eating period window. What do you find is good suggestions for people and what they should learn more about in your book?
Yeah, no, I actually had the great honor and privilege of having Beth Lipton write the recipes for this book. And she and I are very carnivore-ish. The book is not to suggest that everyone needs to lean that direction. I just feel best on a heavy meat-based diet. That's just where my body does best. So the body leans towards animal-based protein, although there are some vegetarian options, but they're not going to have soy. The entire recipe plan is no dairy, and no soy and no gluten, because I think it's important for people to learn how to eat nutrient dense foods. So leaning towards animal-based sources, that includes fish, poultry, as well as meat, lots of non-starchy vegetables, lots of flavor, because I think that's important. When people start thinking about a nutrient dense diet, they freak out thinking, oh my gosh, it's not going to taste good. Oh yes, it will. You need a lot of flavor. And so there's a lot of flavorful recipes. These recipes were tried out with my own family. So they met the picky specifications of 2 teenage boys and a husband. And my husband's kind of like a gourmet chef. So it says a lot that he enjoyed them. And then carbohydrates, if you've earned them. And I like carbs from non-starchy vegetables. I like carbs from low glycemic berries. I like to talk about tart apples. I'm not anti-carb, but if you look again at the bulk of the population, most people are not metabolically healthy. So they have to be conscientious about their carbohydrate intake. It doesn't mean no carbs, but it does mean you're mindful. So I'm going to encourage people to get their carbs from sweet potato and squash and those low glycemic berries and non-starchy vegetables predominantly. And then if you are an athlete or you are super active, or, for me, I always have one day out of the week where I have more protein in my diet, I'm going to bump up my carbs as well. And so I cycle my carbs. That's just for full disclosure. I have one high carb day per week, but there's no, I really fought hard to not count carbohydrates in this book, because I think that adds another layer of stress for a lot of people. They're like, oh, I have to do this fasting thing and now I have to count my carbs. And so I like people to be mindful of their carbohydrates, measuring carbohydrates if necessary. And I do find if people need to lose weight, they have to be mindful of their carbs and their portions. So it may be that you're measuring out half a cup of sweet potato, or maybe you're measuring out, a quarter cup of berries, or whatever it is that you're doing. We try to do it in a thoughtful manner, because nutrition is the most important thing. Meal frequency is a close second. Obviously, they can be married together to have tremendous success. But this book is really, and I almost forgot to mention healthy fats. Sometimes healthy fats are in the meat. So if you're having salmon or a ribeye, you've got your healthy fats in the meat. But fats are the most nutrient dense of all foods. So I remind people, you don't need a lot. Like sometimes when I see people doing keto, it's like half an avocado, or 2 avocados with a ribeye and something else. I remind people, we want to burn our own fat first. We don't want to be eating copious amounts of fat outside our bodies, because it's going to make it a whole lot harder to tap into that freezer for those fat stores. So for anyone that's, curious, the recipes are delicious. Actually, one of the pre-order bonuses is going to be desserts or sweet treats. And when I say desserts, it's going to be like small things that people can enjoy that aren't going to overindulge in. But that's going to be one of the pre-order bonuses that I'm super excited about. Again, written by Beth. It's, things we would have loved to have put in the book, but you have space constraints. And so they'll now be part of the pre-order bonuses.
That's great. I think it is, figuring out what to eat and getting some options, because I think so many people think it's food is, when you're doing lower carb, more protein, I think you think it's boring. And I do believe a lot of it is the Instagram pictures of people doing carnivore.
Yes.
I think it's extremely boring. It's like, I'm not going to have a steak and butter every day. And people show these pictures, I'm like, blah. What if like my husband's a good chef too and loves to cook, and he's not going to just have it just plain and wants to have a good meal. So I think, one, it's not a diet. It's a sustainable way of living, our ancestral way. And it should be natural once you get off of our standard American diet, become fat adapted, metabolically flexible. So you can eat all those good foods that taste great and make it the way you eat is your normal. That I think people have made it such a diet and doing these different things. Like if it's carnivore and then I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But like we've talked about nutritional therapy, eat real food that balances your blood sugar and you burn fat, and then give your body time fasting, give it a little vacation to help digest and do everything it's supposed to do.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for people to understand, like you may have a period of time where maybe you're getting over an illness, or you just want to change things up. You may flip carnivore for a few months. It was the only thing I could eat when I came out of the hospital. I was carnivore for 9 months and I missed vegetables. I really did. You can ask my Italian mother, who was convinced I was going to die because I wasn't eating vegetables, but my body couldn't handle the fiber. And so once my gut started to heal, I was able to eat like that again. But I think it's important for people to understand there's different types of macronutrients. What we're really advocating for is less processed food, more nutrient density, and certainly being mindful of your protein intake. That's number one. Number two is being mindful of your carbohydrate intake. And if you have weight to lose, you have to eat lower carb. This is one of the things that is like the biggest pain point for people that are new to fasting. Like, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't buy into this. I have to eat lower carb. And I'm like, well, if you're having 300 carbs a day, it's not going to hurt you to cut back. And so in the book, we talk about strategies to address what happens in your body when you're, using up glycogen stores or stored sugar, and how you'll start urinating more, and the increased urination, you'll pull, serum sodium and other electrolytes, and why it's so important to properly utilize certain supplements while you're going through that phase to avoid what they call keto flu, but is really just a byproduct of your body kind of detoxing from all those carbohydrates, because carbohydrates get stored in our bodies. And so, once we overfill the storage sites, then they get stored as fat. And so we want to kind of tap into those resources, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I know we're out of time. There's so much to talk about, but we want people to go get your book and read, and then tell us where to find it. And if they're doing the online program, group program, individual coaching, what do you offer?
Thank you. So Intermittent Fasting Transformation, IF45, you can pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, or your local bookstore. So you can go ahead and do that and take advantage of some of the amazing bonuses that are forthcoming. I do teach IF45 as a formal program, usually 4 times a year. So we'll teach it in January and April. April is a maybe, depending on how the book launch phase goes. If I'm doing a lot of traveling, a lot of press, we may push it off until summer. But I'm no longer taking one-on-one clients. I'm kind of pivoting, but I do have an amazing advanced practice nurse who's also on my team, who is taking new clients. I have a podcast called Everyday Wellness, where I get to interview, much like Deb does, some pretty amazing people in the health and wellness space. And beyond that, I'm on social media. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, where I might be a little bit snarky. I have Facebook group, Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. And of course, my website, which I know Deb will include in the show notes. But thank you again for your time. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know I didn't get through all my questions, but there's so many topics, but we will get everyone to get the book and learn from there. And then we can have you on again to go over people's questions. But I think it's a book everyone needs to read. That's a female. And if you're interested in longevity, fat loss, health, everything is in there. So great job, and keep up everything you do. You're amazing, and just always out and about and sharing your passion and following your purpose.
Thank you.